Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Wherever you are in the world, welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Carl Anthony, and this is AutoVision News live at AutoSens Detroit 2023. We are set up in the heart of the Motor City, downtown Detroit, at the Huntington Place. With us is Tom Dahlstrom, an account executive at Kognic. Now, Tom has been working in the field of ADAS and autonomous driving since 2019, originally with a German HD mapping company that was acquired by Bosch in 2022. He is now part of Swedish company Kognic's mission to enable machine learning-based perception development for ADAS and autonomous driving. Tom is also a top voice on LinkedIn when it comes to ADAS, autonomous vehicles, and automotive in general. You may have seen one of his posts, and here he is today. Tom, welcome.
Carl, thanks for having me here.
Yeah.
It's my fourth time to the Detroit area. It's the first time I'm in Detroit proper.
Yes.
With this whole downtown experience and everything, it's a good choice of venue. It's great to be here.
And we did this virtually a couple months back. Now we do it in person. So tell us about Kognic. Let's start there and then we'll kind of go deeper.
Yeah, you mentioned the topic of machine learning and perception in there. So what Kognic does is we build tools. So our offering is a data platform for performance-critical ML applications. And specifically within automotive, that means it's a modular set of software tools for the people, for the teams that develop ML-based ADAS AD perception.
Of course.
Right.
So we were talking just off camera a second ago. There's a buzzword, data pipelines, and we use it as a term all the time, and you hear it all the time. What are your thoughts, though, on that, on data pipelines?
Yeah, it is indeed a term that gets a lot of use out of it, and I've been guilty of the same. The thing that I don't like about the term data pipeline is we're talking about developing ML-based applications, right? Not all of that is black box, but there is still a component to it, right? And that means you're aiming for a moving target. Right? This is a development effort that will take you around a bend or two. So you need to be agile, you need to be flexible, you need to adapt, you need to iterate. And the pipeline is basically the most linear thing you can think of, right? And that's the way of working that it perpetuates, right? So originally you would have this data lake where all of your data gets stored from all the drives that you do, et cetera, et cetera. And you pump it all in there. And then eventually you pump it through the data pipeline into sort of a scenario library of things. And then you have that, and then you can use it for training or validation, is the thought behind it. The problem is that this scenario library has a half-life that is so short that the thing is out of date before you even finish building it. The reason is the world is a mess, right? Your supplier will discontinue a certain camera. Some kid at Google will write a new algorithm next year that's going to change the way everyone does ML. Suddenly there's a pandemic. People are now wearing masks and look entirely different. You are sitting on 20 terabytes of unmasked people, so you have no information. So the world changes all the time. There's new regulation, blah, blah, blah. So doing this as a build once, use all the time kind of deal doesn't work out. So that's why I'm a bit allergic to the data pipeline.
That makes sense. And so you may have touched on this a little bit, but the challenge of developing data-defined perception systems, how can this be met more effectively and more efficiently then, so we don't sit on, a mountain of data that we can't use?
Yeah. So anyone working on software or working on ML will tell you that an iterative way of working is what you need. You build, you test, you validate, you build again, you modify, you refine, etc. So what we need to do is we need to enable a transition from data pipelines to data flywheels, if you will, where you have a continuous loop of that.
Go for it. So what do you mean by data flywheel? Fascinating.
So basically the way we think about this, and that's the philosophy that we apply to the tools that we are building, is you shouldn't fall into the trap of spending 3 months of over-specifying something you may or may not need, and then go through 2 months of supplier screening, blah, 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 and then start producing something. And after 9 months, you get tons and tons of data, and then you start to figure out, is this useful or not? So what we believe is you should close the loop there and bring your own model into the data effort as well. So continuously comparing model predictions from the model under development to the ground truth data, seeing where do they deviate, where do they disagree the most. Is that due to issues in my model? Is that due to issues in my data set? So look at the data set not as a statical thing that you build once and then you use it for whatever, but as an object that is also under development. So the data itself, the guidelines, the workflows you apply to this, etc.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
comes back to that iteration principle all the time.
Right, data flywheel. So another term, I mentioned the data pipeline. I had another term written down here because I want to pick your brain on this. When we hear things like model and human in the loop, model and human in the loop, that's what you're describing.
That's basically what we believe, right?
Okay.
So if you use training data for supervised learning, then that means humans are putting labels in the data.
Okay.
So you're placing bounding boxes or you're doing semantical segmentation, yes, or whatever. So you have the human in the loop, right? And then you produce a data set and you want to see how good is it? What am I getting? And that's where you can bring in your model. Because quality controlling 100% of your data set is too much of an effort. You can't do that. But if you bring the model into the loop to see, again, create this confusion matrix, where do they deviate, the model and the ground truth? Right. This very quickly brings like those 0.1% of errors that are super hard to find otherwise, but that are very critical and that will trip you up in training. It brings those to the surface.
Right.
So you can easily skim off typical annotation errors, like people make mistakes and algorithms make mistakes. There's going to be errors in there. But also, and this is particularly interesting, you will find instances that you hadn't even thought of.
Okay, yeah.
Like, let's say you have an annotation effort that says, I only want to annotate cars that are on the road, not cars that are somewhere else.
Sure.
And so annotators will produce an annotation like that, and if there is a truck on the highway that is carrying cars, like to the dealership, right, they will not annotate those cars. Your model, however, will likely pick them up.
Right.
And if then you use that piece of data that you have labeled for training and you penalize the model for picking those out,
right,
that's not an effect that you want to have, because the annotation itself is 100% correct according to your guidelines, but your model isn't wrong either. So this is these gray zone cases that you spot where you start to figure out, okay, I need to figure out what to do with this. And it's impossible to sit down on day zero and specify all this down.
Right.
Yeah. I've seen guidelines that have 50 pages for how to treat dynamic objects only, with insanely detailed things about what to do when one object is reflected in the windshield of another, but it's not actually an object, it's just an image of a car on a billboard. Try to specify that up front. So again, the world is a mess.
Yes.
You expose yourself to it and figure out what to do as you move along. And then maybe I need to introduce the concept of an ignore zone over here or something.
Yes, yes.
But you learn insanely much when you are hands-on with data like that.
Right. You mentioned learning. What are some examples of key learnings? And I am just learning what this data flywheel, like this is all new to me, Tom. So if I'm repeating myself here with a question, but what are some of the key learnings? What other key learnings come out of this? This is fascinating.
I mean, it's more or less what we just touched upon with these gray zone cases, right? Yeah. So if you bring model and human in the loop, you will find instances where there are simple annotation mistakes. You will find instances where the model is wrong. And you will find these cases that you didn't think of, but that you need to handle. Sort of like, okay, there's a reflection of a car in a something. Yeah. How do I deal with this in my data curation / annotation type of thing, so that I don't create an adverse effect? So how can I connect the dots between what I have here to the impact that I'm seeing on model performance? And that is, you need to be hands-on with data to get that.
Yeah.
And then you're going to learn a lot of stuff that you didn't even think about before.
This is incredible. Tom, I mean, with all of this that we've covered and talked about, what is on the horizon that we should be paying attention to? What's on the horizon, do you think, that we should just be aware of?
Well, that's a very broad question. I can say one thing that has been interesting for me here, because we're a European company, right? We're based out of Sweden. So we have a lot of legacy auto, of course, in Europe, right? Very long tradition companies. And the question of who develops this
Yeah.
I'm starting to realize is answered differently in Europe and here. Like the question, do the OEMs do this? Does the tier one do this?
Right.
Or then we have particularly ambitious tier two companies like semiconductor giants that used to build chips that are now kind of going up the stairs. So we want to capture value here.
Right.
So I believe that there's a certain dynamic happening there. Like who is going to capture that value?
Yes.
It's the age of software-defined vehicles.
Yeah.
Are OEMs going to be the ones that want this as a differentiator?
Mm-hmm.
Are the semiconductor companies gobbling it up? What happens to the tier ones in this case and so on?
Right.
So that is something the jury is obviously still out on, but something to stay on top of, at least for this field.
My last question here, Tom, and I'm excited to continue this dialogue with you off air and over email. I want to go back to the gray areas to make those gray areas that you said, to make sure that I'm understanding. If we don't address the gray, or let me phrase the question this way: do we make roads safer if we address the gray areas? If we go in and we find the gray areas and we address them and we find a solution to them, does that make cars safer? Does that make roads safer? Or help me, or am I not?
Yeah.
Is that not correct?
Yeah, I mean, yes. The goal is to do that, right? You need, this goes back to what we were speaking about when we did the recorded interview, performance and safety, right?
Yes.
You need to get those two right.
Right.
And it's relatively easy to get your performance to 80%, to 90x% or whatever. But with the amount of cars on the road and the amount of miles that we drive, even 99% isn't enough. You know this. But how much? 99.9999.
Correct.
And someone at a conference I was at in Berlin a month ago said this very succinctly, I think. He said, what you're doing there is you're looking for needles in a haystack. Yeah. You're trying to find those edge cases, those corner cases that you need to iron out in order to get all those nines behind the comma. Yeah. And if you're looking for a needle in a haystack, then adding more hay is of limited use.
There you go. Yeah, that's it.
So it's really all about being that inquisitive and having resources, having tools that allow you to do that without getting bogged down in petabytes of data.
Right. Thank you for this quick lesson and overview, Tom. This is I enjoy following you on LinkedIn for this very reason, but wanted to get you in person here. And yeah, I mean, my mind is spinning. But data flywheels, gray areas. Encourage all of our viewers to think with that in mind. To connect with Tom on LinkedIn. Data flywheels. Addressing the gray areas. Yeah, Tom, thank you so much.
It's been a blast. Thank you for having me. And if anyone's watching this who happens to be coming by tomorrow, we're here on the show floor. So I'm happy to demo this also live to look at some of these grayscale edge cases.
Tom, I'll look forward to speaking with you off camera. In the meantime, have a great rest of the show. Safe travels back home. And thank you again. More to come from AutoSens Detroit here on the AutoVision News LinkedIn page from the Huntington Place in downtown Detroit. I'm Carl Anthony, AutoVision News.